When George Lucas created Star Wars, he always did so with a very clear cut idea of who the good guys and who the bad guys were. After all, the film to him was meant to serve as an allegory for the dangers of what the United States could become, and very much considered the original trilogy to operate as an allegory for the Vietnam War, comparing the rebels to the Viet Cong fighters and the Empire to what the United States could potentially become under the Nixon administration. With that in mind, it's very clear when he made Star Wars that it was done with a clear-cut idea that the Empire were the bad guys, and much of their aesthetic, their behavior, and, of course, who the big bad of the entire trilogy is, would also showcase that. So then, when you get to the prequel trilogy, a lot of people would treat it the same way. The idea that the Republic are clearly the good guys and the Separatists are clearly the bad guys. After all, it's very easy to basically have that idea when basically the poster boy of the CIS is Count Dooku, who is a, notable Sith Lord. And and then the other big poster boys for the CIS are people like Newt Gunray, Wat Tambor, Pago the Lesser, all these, mega corporation war profiteers, and, it would even be forgivable to think that's all the CIS would be composed of. I mean, that's kind of all that's showcased within the movies itself. But if you read deeper into the movies, and especially if you look into external sources, you begin finding out that that's not the case at all, and that perhaps there's more to the CIS than meets the eye. Now, I do think it is clear that when we are talking about, the prospect of the Separatists being the good guys, that we're saying it with the idea that we're talking about the actual Separatists and not someone like Dooku, who really only used the movement to advance the Sith agenda, or even members of the Separatist Council, as much as they serve a big factor within the CIS government. It doesn't change the fact that the council really were only in it for the money, and basically so they could openly engage in war profiteering, and some of them were even, fully aware and on board with the Sith grand plan that Sidious had. It was just, of course, the only thing they didn't know is that Sidious was gonna completely purge them as soon as the war was over. So, when we're talking about the Separatists, we're referring to the actual everyday person within the Confederacy of Independent Systems, and really thinking about why would they want to leave the Republic, were they in the right to leave the Republic, and really, could they be considered the good guys over the Republic, both as individual people and, within the CIS government as a whole. So, with that in mind, there's a lot to break down here. So, what the Separatist worlds were actually composed of were primarily worlds stemming from the Outer Rim. So, within the lore, it's basically showcased that the Republic stood for 1,000 years. It gradually became more and more corrupt, it became more negligent, and basically what happened is that it ended up becoming this sort of exploitive system where it would basically extract resources and whatever else through taxes and all that from the Outer Rim, where it would benefit the core worlds, but it would often come at the expense of both the Mid and the Outer Rim, but especially the Outer Rim. And the Republic really did little to nothing to protect the Outer Rim, which led to the Outer Rim basically getting exploited by pirates, slavers, gangs, you name it. Basically, all of these different groups were taking advantage of the Outer Rim worlds, and the Republic really didn't do much, if anything, to stop that. If anything, a lot of times they would end up being complacent with the corruption taking place, both by organizations like the Hutt Cartel as well as the mega corporations, which eventually became so bad that corporations even ended up having a seat within the Galactic Senate. So not only could they basically bribe senators to do what they wanted, but they could even have a direct vote within the Senate to get their way and overturn the democratic process to best help the people, in particular within the Outer Rim. And this eventually hits kind of a final straw during the Battle of Naboo. Up until this point, many Outer Rim worlds were really trying to wait to see if things will turn around. And then they noticed this, really big thing going on, which is that the Trade Federation launches an invasion on Naboo. And literally, this is a mid-rim planet, so in many ways they have, even more influence than what the average Outer Rim planet does. And here it is, being invaded and put under military occupation by the Trade Federation. And then when Queen Amidala is pleading her case to the Senate that her world is under an unjust occupation, they get bogged down within bureaucracy and only suggest sending a committee to ascertain the situation rather than actually taking any real action to put an end to the occupation. And so eventually Amidala ends up doing something that is a shock to the rest of the Outer Rim. She gets Naboo to fight back against the Trade Federation themselves. And not only do they fight back against the Trade Federation, but they successfully defeat them and force them to have to renegotiate the trade disputes and everything else on their terms. And this basically serves as a inspiration for the rest of the Outer Rim. So then around 8 years after the events of the Phantom Menace, or the Naboo Crisis, Count Dooku ends up giving a speech on Raxus called the Raxus Address. And this address basically calls out the Republic's corruption within the Senate. It calls out the inefficiencies of the Jedi Order and the injustices that were carried out against the Outer Rim. And so Dooku ends up calling upon worlds to secede from the Republic in joining the Confederacy of Independent Systems. And what Dooku promised under the Confederacy of Independent Systems, the CIS or Separatist Alliance, whatever term you would rather go by, is that they promised to have a more decentralized government where greater autonomy would be granted to the individual worlds to have better self-determination. And so that way decisions could be done for the benefit of individual worlds without having to go through quite as large of a bureaucracy that the Republic did. They also promised to have a more democratic system than the Republic due to the fact that the Separatist Parliament, which was their legislative body, wasn't going to have any type of corporate influence within it, that none of the corporations were going to have representation within this parliament, and that worlds within the Confederacy of Independent Systems were going to have far greater determination on deciding what was best for their planets, that the main thing the parliament was going to exist for was just enforcing civil legislation. And so the biggest attribute that made up the ideology of the Confederacy of Independent Systems was sort of this acknowledgement that every system was different and all of them should have authority to really govern themselves as they best see fit. And within aspects such as the economy, they also really marketed the idea of having very low taxation so that more poor Outer Rim worlds would be able to more easily trade with one another and not have to worry about their resources being pillaged. by, a giant bureaucracy, that instead it would just be something where if one world wanted to trade with another world, they could freely do so through a voluntary consent with one another, and that within the economy, within culture, within politics, all of these worlds were kind of treated as almost a very laissez-faire way of government, where it's kind of like every small organization or individual in a way is kind of almost their own king. So I will freely admit right here and right now that the answer for this question is not really one that should be considered completely objective or universal. A lot of attributes that make up the answer to this question really does kind of come down to our own point of view, but I will do my best to try to be as non-biased for answering this as possible. So, as we discussed in the earlier segments, the Galactic Republic had many years, if not decades, to try to rectify the issues of the Outer Rim to no avail, and from there, the ideals of the Outer Rim ended up going into direct conflict with the Galactic Republic, and eventually the Outer Rim concluded. Many of the worlds that seceded from the Republic and joined the Confederacy of Independent Systems did so, eventually being convinced that the Republic was no longer acting in their best interests. And so the issue in relation to this is, does the Republic's sovereignty override the Outer Rim's desire to secede? So, legally speaking, the issue related to secession has been left to be at most vague. We know every star system that joined the Republic did so voluntarily, as the Republic was founded initially to be more of a coalition rather than one singular giant government. And over time, this would end up changing as the Galactic Republic ended up getting a lot larger and representing more and more worlds, and eventually the Republic came to kind of represent the majority of the galaxy, so it almost kind of became a point where it wasn't really viewed as a coalition anymore, but rather a single united body, similar to kind of what you would see under the United States. Now, to make a comparison to that war, while it is easy to look at the surface level and say that the CIS is just doing the same thing as the CSA, and that basically it's like their call for secession is illegitimate, I do personally believe there are separation behind the circumstances that would make the CIS's call for secession legitimate, while for the Confederate States of America it wasn't. The South's attempt to secede was very much rooted in, one, it was rooted in a very abhorrent cause, that being preserving and even expanding the institution of slavery, which already presented a rather poor moral ground for why the secession was happening. The second, and in some ways equally important factor, is that the South didn't even really wait to see if Lincoln's administration would have done something that would have violated their quote-unquote rights. That as soon as Lincoln won the election, which they even sabotaged themselves, basically trying to overturn the democratic process, they already began these massive calls for secession, and do so not even, as a response to any actions that the Union did, but rather just what Lincoln stood for as a president. And it ended up getting to the point where the president of the Confederate States of America, Jefferson Davis, was inaugurated even before President Lincoln was even inaugurated in office. By contrast, the Outer Rim worlds that ended up joining the Confederacy of Independent Systems, for the most part, pleaded their situations towards the Galactic Senate, and operated where all of these worlds were already suffering major injustices from the Republic. that they were trying to rectify through more peaceful means. And a lot of times it would just be showcased how the Republic was being an unfair arbiter within many political issues surrounding the galaxy. A good example of this is such as the Huck War between the Kaleesh and the Yamari, where the Yamari had Klee all but enslaved, and when the Kaleesh ended up fighting back, trying to gain their liberation and push to the Yamari home planet, the Yamari used their connections to the Trade Federation to basically convince the Republic that the Kaleesh were the aggressors, and the Republic immediately sends a Jedi task force to just put down the Kaleesh uprising, and even imposing really heavy sanctions against Klee without even looking at the other side of the story and trying to get the accounts of the Kaleesh who were fighting just to try to liberate themselves from the control of the Yamari. In fact, this unfair treatment of Klee is precisely what caused General Grievous, who all but led this uprising to try to achieve freedom for his people, the Kaleesh. This is the reason why he developed such a burning hatred for both the Republic and the Jedi. And a similar situation would happen during the Mandalorian Civil War, where the Republic basically had the Jedi dispatched to almost all but wipe out the true Mandalorians because the Death Watch were essentially playing victim, and the Republic yet again didn't really try to get the other side of the story of what was going on. And as a result, it caused the true Mandalorians, all except for Jango, to go all but extinct. In fact, even within the argument of the Clone Wars itself, the very first concern when the Separatist crisis really starts becoming prominent is the Republic pushes for the Military Creation Act. And the Military Creation Act basically would have tried to integrate the Separatist worlds back into the Republic by force without providing any kind of referendum or even offering some kind of compromise to the Outer Rim worlds that had very legitimate grievances with the Republic. Instead, they already kind of come in with this mindset of war, and Count Dooku kind of best explains this during the speech he gives in Dark Disciple, which I will read out to everyone here. Quote, "It is an honor to stand before you, for you represent the freedom and the future of our galaxy. The once great Republic and Jedi Order have become victims of their own ambitions, and the Supreme Chancellor is no more than a pawn of corporate monopolies. As a people, you called out for change. You called out for leadership, and I humbly answered that call. Together, we challenged the system. We asked for equality, and how were we met? With war. The Jedi's secret army of clones was revealed, and their treachery was far greater than what we could have imagined. Countless living beings, these clones the Jedi created, have been sent to their deaths, while we sacrifice mainly droids. Our soldiers of flesh and blood are willing participants. They are your fathers and sons, mothers and daughters, who fight not because they were grown and designed to do so, but because they know in their hearts that they are fighting for a just and noble cause." And this also calls out how the Republic, once when they did commission the army to fight in the Clone Wars, they commissioned the Clone Army. The Clone Army was effectively a slave army of these organic beings that were grown in a test tube to fight and die in a war that they had very little understanding of, and really had no choice in the matter, as the clones don't have citizenship, they don't have a right to vote, and were even regarded as legal property to the Galactic Republic themselves. I mean, really think about that. They're literally enslaving an entire army that was just bred to fight and die in a war that they have no say in, as any clone that attempted to leave was usually either arrested or killed for desertion. And the clones were indoctrinated and brainwashed since birth to basically believe that this was the best life they could have. So having the clones even adjust to normal society was going to be next to impossible. So all of these ramifications, as if they weren't bad enough, was only made worse when you factor the inhibitor chips that literally strip these human beings of their own free will to essentially do whatever the Republic and later the Empire wanted them to do without question. Meanwhile, the Confederacy of Independent Systems was primarily using an army of droids, which were composed of unthinking, unfeeling, essentially robots. And while there were ethical issues surrounding droids, it was seen as comparatively far more ethical than what the Republic was doing with the clone army, as the droids at the very least were not living beings that were essentially being enslaved. On top of that, as Dooku pointed out within his speech in Dark Disciple, the few organic beings that were consistently fighting within the CIS were volunteers who pledged their allegiance to the Confederacy of Independent Systems not because they were brainwashed into doing so, but because they legitimately believed in the ideology. When you combine all this with the fact that the Galactic Senate was literally willing to support and install a fascist dictatorship instead of allowing the Outer Rim worlds to leave and recognizing the Confederacy of Independent Systems as legitimate, it really does paint the Republic in not really the best light. And it definitely could be argued that the Republic was tyrannical for, at the very least, not trying to meet the needs of the Outer Rim worlds, and yet at the same time we're still expecting them to remain in the Republic for the sake of maintaining a status quo. And now we finally get to the end of the video where I can answer the million-dollar question. Were the Separatists the good guys? And, well, the answer is both yes and no at the same time. I know, cop-out answer. But before breaking it down, let's explain. The Confederacy of Independent Systems, as we discussed earlier, was founded on solid ideals. And it was founded with legitimate grievances against the Republic. When you combine those two factors together, it definitely would answer the question leaning closer to, yes, they are the good guys, at least from a political perspective, considering that the only argument the Republic really could make would denying the Outer Rim world's secession would just be under legal grounds, and even then, an argument could be made that because the Republic abandoned its duties as a legitimate government to the Outer Rim, that it did give these worlds the right to secede and attempt to build a system that would better meet their needs and ensure their prosperity without being exploited by the core. This fact is only made more apparent when considering the fact that most separatists that joined the Confederacy of Independent Systems were not out to try to destroy the Republic altogether, and instead found that a peaceful coexistence between the two governments was in fact possible, and not only possible but desirable. And considering the prospect that the Separatist Parliament was willing to give an olive branch for peace, long before the Republic was willing to do so, mainly led by Senator Mina Bonteri, there's definitely an argument to be made that the Separatist Parliament had a lot more dignity and had a less desire for war than the Republic Senate did. So then it kind of brings the question of why did I try to separate the answers and say politically they were the good guys? The reason I say that is because even though they are in a sense politically the good guys, and even spent most of this video pretty much justifying the secession of the Outer Rim and justifying the existence of the Confederacy of Independent Systems. However, that being said, while they are definitely politically the good guys, they are not practically the good guys. And the reason why really comes down to three major factors. The first and most major factor, of course, is the Sith Grand Plan. Both Dooku and Sidious were not looking to actually have the CIS win or have any of their ideals come to fruition. Instead, the entire movement was just being used as a front in order for Palpatine to gain more power within the Republic. And so, the problem with the Confederacy of Independent Systems is, in spite of how many good points it makes, and how righteous it can even try to claim itself as a government, it doesn't change the fact that, at the end of the day, it is primarily a Sith-controlled puppet state. The second reason comes down to the Separatist Council. You see, the Separatist Council were representatives from all the mega-corporations, and the thing that is often overlooked is that many of these corporations, such as the Trade Federation and the Techno Union, were directly responsible for a lot of the suffering that went on in the Outer Rim in the first place. And the reason they departed from the Republic and joined the Confederacy of Independent Systems was not for any sense of moral righteousness, it was entirely for self-gain, as most of them joined, at best, in order to escape the economic and political regulations that the Republic had on them, thus not having to deal with the few restrictions the Republic imposed on them, and at worst, merely joined in order to engage in war profiteering and profit out of using the separatist movement as a front to gain a crap load of credits from both sides, essentially playing both sides of the war, with some council members even being aware of the Sith Grand Plan, and pretty much all of them knowing the existence of both Darth Sidious as well as Count Dooku's status as Darth Tyrannus. And so the Separatist Council members were acting almost counterintuitive to the goals of the Separatist Parliament and the ideological Separatists as a whole, all in the name of profiting or even trying to get a cushy position within the Galactic Empire when that ended up getting formed. And the third and final reason really came down to Separatist atrocities. The thing is that due to the previous two reasons earlier, the Separatists would commit a heinous amount of war crimes during the war, as well as just crimes against sentient beings. And this would range from economic exploitation of conquered worlds, mistreatment of POWs, torture, aligning with Zygerian and Trandoshan slavers, committing acts of terrorism, and even committing genocide. Remember the Yamari from earlier that enslaved the Kaleesh? Grievous would later on take armies of battle droids to launch a genocidal campaign, the Yamari, and would end up committing an entire genocide on the species to the point where the Yamari were driven to near extinction. These kind of atrocities were also repeated during Operation Dirge's Lance, where General Grievous pushed into the core worlds and wiped out all life on an entire planet, and would also commit a similar action on Dathomir, wiping out an entire Night Witch clan. And it also puts into consideration how many worlds ended up getting invaded and forcibly integrated by the Confederacy, and how basically neutrality in the war was an extremely dangerous risk to take, not only because of the chance of Republic reintegrating the world by force, but by the Separatists, or the Confederacy of Independent Systems, invading the world and taking it by force. So, in a final note, the Confederacy of Independent Systems were not the good guys in a practical sense, as the atrocities they committed and many of the hypocritical moves that they did ultimately meant that, in spite of how good their movement was in theory and how much it had legitimate complaints of the Republic, it ended up allowing itself to become a system just as bad as the Republic, and in some areas even worse, when factoring that the Republic did at the very least fight the Clone Wars more cleanly than the Separatists did. Of course, that's not to say the Republic didn't commit its own fair share of war crimes, and honestly, a lot of the things the Republic did wrong during the Clone Wars is honestly worthy of its own video. But to answer as a final talking note, the Separatists were in the right for seceding, and they were politically the good guys, but they were not the good guys in a practical sense. Neither the Republic nor the Separatists were. And so, really, who was right pretty much comes down to your own point of view. But overall, no side was completely right, but neither side was completely wrong either, and the Separatists were at the very least justified in seceding from the Republic. They just weren't justified in fighting the war the way they did. Well, that concludes today's video. I hope everyone enjoyed. This is kind of something different that I decided to do, but it was a video I kind of wanted to make for quite some time, with the surge of Star Wars content that's starting to kind of surround the Separatists a little bit more, which is something that's been kind of rare as of late, so I figured it was a good time to make a video like this. I hope you all enjoyed this video. If you did, please consider giving it a like, subscribing, and posting in the comments below what you guys think. Were the Separatists really the good guys, or was the Republic the good guys the whole time and death to the clankers? Let me know in the comments below. With that in mind, I hope you all enjoyed, and I'll see you next time. Peace.